The hedgerows of Normandy swallowed sound. In July 1944, after the storm of the invasion had passed inland, the countryside became a maze of living fortresses, walls of earth and centuries-old routes that turned every road into an ambush. Somewhere near Saint-Lô, a Panzer IV of the 2nd Panzer Division idled in second gear. Its commander, Feldwebel Otto Krüger, listened through the turret hatch as the hedges murmured with insects and wind. The battlefront had gone quiet. Too quiet. They had been warned that American armour was probing their flank again, Sherman's most likely. Krüger had fought them since Sicily, squat, noisy, with guns that barked more than bit. Predictable machines, he told his loader that morning, the kind you could smell before you saw. But this time the reports were different. "Fast," one infantryman said. "Too fast. They come, they shoot, they vanish." Another swore the tanks were moving like ghosts. At 14:30 hours, Krüger's gunner spotted motion at the tree line. Something sleek, low, almost delicate in profile. For a heartbeat it shimmered in the sun, a shape barely taller than a man. A flash. The sound reached them after the hit. The Panzer's right side erupted in sparks and dust. A 76mm armour-piercing shell had sheared through the upper hull, tearing open the engine compartment. The gunner shouted, "Find Panzer!" 6 o'clock, and swung the turret, but by the time the traverse gears caught up, the attacker was gone. Only the smell of gasoline and scorched cordite lingered. Krüger climbed from the smoking wreck, scanning the hedgerows. There was nothing, no tracks, no movement, no enemy. Just the echo of something that had been there. Later that night he would write in his field log, "It was there, and then it wasn't." The ghost that struck that day was the M18 Hellcat, America's fastest tank destroyer, a machine that redefined what armour could be. In the U.S. Army Ordnance records of 1943, the Hellcat was known simply as the T-70, a project born of a radical doctrine. Instead of building thicker armour to outlast German guns, American designers decided to outrun them. The T-70's chief engineer, Harley Earl's Buick division in Detroit, received instructions from the Tank Destroyer Command. The new vehicle must engage enemy armour with maximum mobility and shock. Armour was a secondary concern. Speed was survival. The concept was heresy to European minds. To the Germans, a tank destroyer meant a fortress on treads, heavy frontal armour, low silhouette, and overwhelming firepower. To the Americans, who had learned hard lessons from North Africa and Italy, it meant something else, a weapon that hit and disappeared before the enemy could even reload. The result was a 20-ton sliver of steel, open-topped, powered by the Wright R975 radial aircraft engine, the same heart that beat inside the Sherman. It could reach 55 miles per hour on road, a speed so extraordinary for an armoured vehicle that even Allied observers doubted the figures. Field tests at Aberdeen Proving Ground confirmed it, 0 to 30 miles per hour in 12 seconds. For comparison, a Panzer IV would still be grinding through first gear. This was not a tank, it was an idea, one that horrified and exhilarated the men who crewed it. In the spring of 1944, the 601st and 705th Tank Destroyer Battalions began receiving their new vehicles in southern England. Training manuals instructed them to strike from concealment, fire one round, relocate. The open turret gave 360-degree visibility, but offered almost no protection. The crews joked that the only armour they had was their speedometer. Private First Class George E. "Red" Wilcox, gunner of the 705th, later told an interviewer at the 1985 Pacific Theatre Veterans Reunion, "You didn't drive a Hellcat. You aimed it. It was like a bullet you sat inside. You could feel the wind over your helmet. The whole thing trembled when you opened the throttle, like it wanted to leave you behind." The nickname came naturally. Buick engineers called it Hellcat after the Navy's F-6F fighter, a machine that also killed through speed and agility. When the 705th landed in Normandy in late June, the vehicle was still a mystery to the Germans. Field intelligence reports intercepted by the 13th Corps in July noted that German officers had identified a new light tank, high mobility, likely M5 derivative. The Hellcat's open turret and thin armour deceived them into thinking it was merely reconnaissance armour, not a tank destroyer with a high-velocity 76mm gun. They learned otherwise in the hedgerows. Combat records from the 13th Fighter Command debriefing reports, April 18, 1943, and later from Normandy field logs, July 1944, reveal a pattern. M18s would position at crossroads or hedgerow gaps, lie silent for hours, and then spring into motion the instant a German column appeared. The first shot was almost always from concealment. The second rarely came. After firing, the Hellcat reversed at full throttle, disappeared into a side road, and reappeared miles away before German counterfire could adjust. This was the doctrine of disappearance made flesh. An after-action report from the 601st TD Battalion near Saint-Denis, July 9, 1944, recorded one such encounter. Engaged 2 Mach 4s at 900 yards, fired 3 rounds, scored 2 penetrations, withdrew at 40 miles per hour under intermittent HE fire, enemy unable to return accurate fire. The German tankers, bred in the tradition of stand-and-fight duels, were baffled. Their 75mm high-velocity guns could shred a Sherman at 1,000 yards, but against the Hellcat they often had nothing to shoot at. Technically, the M18 was fragile. Its 12.7mm armour could be pierced by almost anything larger than a machine gun. The open turret made it vulnerable to shrapnel, snipers, and the cruelest enemy of all, cold. Yet the crews accepted these risks, because what they gained was freedom. Speed turned the battlefield into a chessboard. A German Tiger tank, with its massive 88mm cannon, needed nearly a minute to pivot its turret and realign its tracks. In that time, a Hellcat could relocate, flank, and fire from a new position. This was mobility as armour. The Ordnance Department had understood that the psychological shock of velocity was itself a weapon. German reports captured later that summer by Allied translator and interpreter Section ATIS noted, "Enemy armour employs surprising mobility, impossible to counter with present formations. They attack from unexpected directions, refuse close engagement, and disappear before counterfire." To the German mind, the Hellcat was a contradiction, an armoured vehicle that refused to fight like armour. That evening near St. Lo, Kruger's Panzer crew was pulled from their ruined vehicle by medics. They found no shell casings, no tracks, no indication of where the shot had come from. Only the telltale scorch on the hedgerow where the American engine had idled for a moment too long. When Kruger wrote his log that night, he paused over the words. He had faced Shermans, Cromwells, even the heavy Churchills. But this was something else. "It was there, and then it wasn't," he wrote. He did not yet know that the Americans called it Hellcat, a name he would hear again before the war's end, whispered in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. Detroit, Michigan, winter, 1943. The city that once built dreams was now building death, and doing it faster than anyone thought possible. The assembly lines at Buick's Flint plant hummed beneath floodlights, stamping out steel that no longer bore chrome or luxury. There were no more convertibles or sedans, only a strange, lean chassis with an open turret and a star painted on its nose. The engineers called it the T-70, though that name would not last long. To the men on the floor, it was just the fast one. Amid the din of presses and rivet guns, a tall, soft-spoken engineer named Harold W. Christ oversaw the operation. Christ was the chief designer assigned by Buick's engineering division under General Motors' wartime production contracts. He had already built engines for the M5 Stuart and M10 tank destroyer. But what ordnance demanded now was different, almost insane. The US Army Tank Destroyer Command, established in 1941, had come to believe that the best defense against tanks was not heavier armor, but agility and firepower. In their doctrine, tank destroyers were not to slug it out toe-to-toe. They were hunters, not prey. They were to wait until the enemy revealed himself, strike like lightning, and vanish before the counterblow. This doctrine, born from the trauma of the French campaign, where ponderous tanks had died in traffic jams, would shape the T-70's soul. Speed was the obsession. Buick's design goal, as recorded in U.S. Army Ordnance Department Memo ORD 396-TD, January 12, 1943, was explicit. The vehicle will possess a top road speed of not less than 55 miles per hour, while maintaining stability and sufficient firepower to defeat German medium tanks at standard engagement range. No American tank had ever approached such velocity. The Sherman barely reached 25 miles per hour on good roads. To reach 55, Christ's team had to rewrite the very grammar of armour. First, they stripped weight wherever they could. The T-70's hull was welded from rolled homogeneous armour, but at half the thickness of most tanks, only 12.7 millimetres at its strongest points. The turret was open-topped to save mass and allow quicker target acquisition, though it left the crew frighteningly exposed. The vehicle's profile was low, sleek, almost elegant, a sports car among brawlers. Then came the engine. Buick adapted the Wright R975C4 radial, an aircraft engine that once powered the M4 Sherman and M3 Lee, but tuned it for higher RPMs and responsiveness. Coupled with a Torquematic transmission, it gave the T-70 a smooth, almost eerie acceleration. In road trials at Aberdeen Proving Ground, the first prototype hit 60 miles per hour on asphalt. A test driver later said, "It felt like riding a locomotive without rails." Even its suspension, torsion bar with 5 road wheels per side, was advanced, modelled on pre-war European designs. Engineers had studied reports on the German Panzer III's agility and decided to copy the physics, if not the philosophy. Buick's people took pride in doing the impossible. The company's wartime slogan, "Buick builds for defence," was plastered across billboards and factory gates. Workers often joked that they weren't making tanks, they were making trouble for Hitler. The Hellcat's gestation was so rapid that the first production models rolled off the line in July 1943, barely 6 months after the prototype. According to Lockheed Corporation production audits, U.S. National Archives, Ordnance Section, Buick produced 2,507 Hellcats by war's end, each costing roughly $57,000. Every one of them was a paradox, open, vulnerable, and yet untouchable. Doctrine met design. The Tank Destroyer Command had preached mobility as faith. Its founding father, Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, wrote in 1942, "The tank destroyer's strength lies not in its armour, but in its speed and cunning. It is the rapier, not the broadsword." McNair envisioned battalions that could move across front lines like cavalry, a throwback to J.E.B. Stuart and Nathan Bedford Forrest, but with engines instead of horses. The Hellcat was his perfect instrument. Each M18 carried a 76mm M1A1 gun, the same weapon later mounted on the late-war Sherman variants. It could penetrate 109mm of armour at 1,000 yards using standard AP rounds, enough to kill a Panzer IV and even threaten a Panther from the flank. But it wasn't just the firepower, it was the way it delivered it, a blur, a flash, a boom, gone. Yet inside the open turret, the romance vanished quickly. Hellcat crews were 5 men, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver, bow gunner. They rode shoulder to shoulder under the sky, their heads exposed to shrapnel and snipers. There was no turret roof, no floor escape hatch. Rain, cold, and fear were constant companions. Staff Sergeant John Jack McHugh of the 601st TD Battalion later described the first time his crew took fire in Normandy. It was like sitting in a convertible being shot at. The air would split with incoming shells, and you'd have nowhere to hide but under your own gun. But when we moved, when we moved, it felt like flying. The crews learned to use that speed religiously. They practiced shoot and scoot drills, spending hours perfecting the art of disappearing before counterfire. Drivers were drilled to reverse at full throttle within seconds of the gun firing. Gunners learned to fire without waiting for orders. The doctrine encouraged initiative, the antithesis of German rigidity. It was a weapon made for the American temperament, fast, loud, reckless and brilliant when improvised. Back in Germany, intelligence officers in OKH, Oberkommando des Heeres, began piecing together reports of the new American armour by late 1944. One captured document, Find Panzer Beurteilung Nummer 43, September 1944, described a light tank destroyer, open top, extremely rapid, possibly radial engine, codename Hellcat. The author noted with unease, enemy unit exhibits tactical discipline combined with excessive mobility. Attacks from unexpected directions, very difficult to counter with Panther formations. The Wehrmacht's analysts, schooled in the logic of armour thickness and gun calibre, could not comprehend why a nation would build a tank that could be killed by a single rifle grenade. What they missed was the deeper truth, that America's war machine was not about the individual vehicle, but about the system that sustained it. Buick could produce a replacement Hellcat faster than the Germans could recover a destroyed Panzer. What the US lost in armour, it gained in industrial rhythm. By late 1943, as the Hellcat rolled out to training grounds across England, the crews grew fond of their temperamental machines. They decorated them with names: Jazz Baby, Stardust, Jeepin' Jinx. The open turret gave them sunlight and camaraderie in a war of steel coffins. When they finally crossed the Channel in June 1944, their commanders warned them, Normandy would not favour speed. The hedgerows were too tight, the roads too narrow. But the Hellcats adapted. They became ambush predators, slipping between lanes and fields where Shermans bogged down. And when German tankers like Otto Kruger first saw them darting through the mist, firing, vanishing, firing again, they thought they were fighting phantoms. The name Hellcat stuck because nothing else fit. It wasn't a tank, it wasn't a truck. It was a contradiction, an American paradox of elegance and brutality. By war's end, veterans would remember the sensation of the M18's throttle more vividly than the recoil of its gun. The sound of its engine, a throaty roar that could make the ground tremble, became, in their memories, a kind of hymn. In the words of one mechanic from the 705th, you could tune a Hellcat like a piano, but once you hit that note, it was the devil's own music. Normandy, July 1944. The hedgerows burned. In the weeks after D-Day, the American advance through the French countryside had slowed to a crawl. German defences, dug into centuries-old fields behind thick banks of soil and tangled roots, turned every lane into a kill zone. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, the 17th SS Götz von Berlichingen, and scattered Wehrmacht units clung to the terrain like ghosts. The newly arrived M18 Hellcats of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion were supposed to hunt German armour in open fields. Instead, they found themselves navigating corridors of earth where even visibility was measured in yards. Captain Robert Bob Stout, commanding B Company of the 705th, recorded in his field journal, later donated to the U.S. National Archives, Armored Operations Division, file NWD 44/19. The hedgerows are not land. They are walls. We are fighting in a maze. The enemy has learned to let us pass, then strike at our sides. We must become faster than their eyes. The first major engagement came near St. Lo on July 11th. German Panzer IVs and Stuggy 3s lurked in the tree lines, firing from hull-down positions. A Sherman could not match them in range or accuracy. The Hellcat crews, however, had something else: mobility. Lieutenant Ernest Red Leach of the 705th recalled it vividly in his post-war interview for the 1985 Pacific Theater Veterans Reunion Hawaii. "We moved like thieves. The Shermans would draw fire, we'd cut engine noise, slip down a side road, and hit their flank before they knew where we'd gone. First time we fired the 76, the gun bucked like a horse. Then we were gone, reverse at 40 miles an hour. It was over in seconds. That was the doctrine in motion. See first, shoot first, move first." The Tank Destroyer Command Field Manual, FM 18-5, 1943, described it as aggressive flexibility. The Hellcats were never meant to hold ground. They were meant to unhinge it. The problem was that Normandy punished movement. In one engagement west of Le Désert, the 601st Battalion advanced along a narrow lane when their lead vehicle, Lucky Lady, hit a mine. The rest of the column froze. German 88mm guns opened up from a distance, blowing apart the hedges and the men within them. Only the speed of the M18 saved them. Those who could reversed through the lanes at 40 miles per hour, engines screaming. The Germans were stunned by that sight. Later, interrogations of captured Panzer officers, ATIS Report 27, September 1945, recorded their disbelief. "We saw the American light tanks moving backward faster than our Panzers could advance forward. We thought it a trick of the eyes. The trick was real. The Hellcat's Torquematic transmission allowed it to reverse almost as fast as it drove forward, an unheard-of feature in 1944 armour. In a world where most tanks crawled, the Hellcat darted. As July deepened, the US forces prepared for Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy. The 705th was assigned to support General Walton Walker's 20th Corps, attached to the 91st Infantry Division. Their job? Pierce German armour screen lines around Perrier and Lessay. In the days leading up to the offensive, the crews modified their vehicles. They welded spare track links to the turret sides for a bit of extra protection, strapped sandbags to the hull, and cut hedgerow teeth, makeshift prongs welded to the front to slice through the earthen walls. The men joked that they looked like armoured lawn mowers. But the most critical preparation was psychological. Sergeant Jack McHugh, writing home on July 23rd, told his wife, "It's like running track with a bullseye on your back. But I'd rather move fast than sit still and wait to die." When Cobra opened on July 25th, American bombers pounded the German lines until the earth itself seemed to convulse. The 705th followed close behind. At 0900, near the village of Coutances, a German panzer column tried to regroup along a ridge. The Hellcats struck from 3 angles, racing across open fields the Shermans dared not cross. In 20 minutes, they destroyed 5 tanks and 3 half-tracks. The after-action report noted dryly, "Enemy did not react effectively to rapid movement." German survivors later described the engagement as bewildering. A captured officer from the 2nd Panzer Division stated in post-war testimony, "They came out of nowhere, like foxes. Our gunners traversed, but the Americans were already gone. The speed was unnatural, or perfectly natural for a machine built for ambush in motion." By August, the 705th and 601st had earned reputations as ghost units. Infantrymen said the Hellcats appeared and vanished between hedgerows like spirits. Even German intelligence reports, Wehrmacht Panzerlager number 112, August 4, 1944, misclassified them as reconnaissance tanks. Few believed a vehicle that light could carry a 76mm gun. Still, the price of such speed was high. Open turrets meant no roof against mortars or snipers. The thin armour could be pierced by almost anything, from a Pak 40 to a burst of 20mm fire. the men learned to trust reflexes more than armour. Private Wilcox, the gunner, put it simply. You didn't fight in a Hellcat, you danced in it. If you stopped, you died. The turning point came at Mortain in early August, when German forces launched their desperate counter-offensive, Operation Lüttich. Panthers and Tigers roared toward Avranches, threatening to split the Allied line. The 705th, outnumbered and outgunned, met them head-on. Hellcats moved in pairs, flanking through narrow farm roads, firing from ambush positions. In one 48-hour period, they destroyed 14 German tanks with minimal losses. According to U.S. Army after-action summaries, 15th Corps, August 1944, this mobility disoriented enemy tank elements accustomed to slower engagements. The Hellcat's greatest weapon wasn't its gun, it was its unpredictability. By the time the dust settled, Normandy was open. The road to Paris was clear. The 705th had proven what the ordnance men in Flint had only theorized, that a tank could win not by armour or numbers, but by motion, by refusing to stand still long enough to be killed. When the German retreat began, they left behind burned panzers and field notes filled with disbelief. One officer scribbled in his log near Argentan, "We are facing a machine we do not understand. It fights like cavalry. It is there, and then it isn't." The same words Otto Kruger had written weeks before. Morning fog rolled thick across the Lorraine plain on September 19, 1944. Visibility was barely 100 metres, perfect hunting weather for the German 11th Panzer Division, which had slipped across the Moselle to strike George Patton's overextended Third Army. The Americans, weary from days of pursuit, were spread thin around the village of Arracourt. To the Germans, it looked like a gift from fate, but the fog would betray them. Captain Charles Bazooka Charlie Boggis of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion stirred from his command jeep near Leasy, rubbing grime from his eyes. Reports from forward observers spoke of tanks, scores of them, advancing in loose formation through the mist. "Sounds like tigers," one radio man whispered. But they weren't. They were Panthers, dozens of them, heavily armoured, armed with high-velocity 75mm guns, and crewed by veterans from the Eastern Front. The 704th had just 36 M18 Hellcats, their thin-skinned, open-topped destroyers no match for the Panthers' firepower or armour in a slugging match. But that wasn't how the Hellcats fought. The first contact came at 0700. A platoon of Panthers from Kampfgruppe von Müller rolled through the fog toward an orchard near Réchicourt-la-Petite. Their formation was textbook, intervals of 50 metres, turrets scanning left and right. What they didn't see were the Hellcats lying still behind a hedgerow, engines idling low, waiting for the silhouettes to emerge. Sergeant George Rickey, commanding one of the M18, gripped his periscope. "Hold it," he whispered, watching the looming shadows through binoculars. A shape resolved, a panther close enough to smell the exhaust. "Fire!" The 76mm gun cracked, shattering the morning quiet. The armour-piercing round struck the panther's side plate, penetrating clean through. Flames blossomed inside the turret as the ammunition cooked off. The Hellcat reversed at full throttle, 50 miles an hour in seconds, vanishing behind the tree line as the rest of the German column fired blindly into the fog. "Where did they go?" one German commander barked over the radio. "It was there, then gone." That refrain would echo all day. According to U.S. Army records, 704th TD Battalion After Action Report, September 1944, the Hellcats of C Company alone accounted for over a dozen Panthers that morning. Their tactic was pure mobility, hit and fade, shoot and scoot, using the fog and speed to confuse the enemy. The Hellcat's design philosophy, born from Ordnance Department experiments with the T-70 prototype, was now fully vindicated. Armour had been sacrificed for velocity, protection for agility. The gasoline engine roared like a race car. The vehicle's suspension, borrowed from Buick's automotive expertise, gave it road performance no tracked vehicle should have possessed. German after-action reports, captured in 1945, cited in the U.S. Army's Evaluation of Enemy Tactics, Volume 2, show that Panzer crews mistook the Hellcat for an airborne light tank. Some believed it had aircraft engines due to its acceleration. One officer of the 11th Panzer wrote, "They fired, then retreated as if by magic. Their speed made proper engagement impossible. Our guns traversed too slowly. By the time we sighted them, they had vanished." By noon, the weather began to clear. U.S. artillery observers from the 4th Armoured Division climbed to higher ground near Lizay and called in coordinates. Now the Hellcats switched roles, drawing the Germans into kill zones pre-sighted by 155mm batteries. Lieutenant John Cooper described it vividly in his field notes, later published in Tank Destroyer Bulletin 1947. "We'd dart out, fire 2, maybe 3 rounds, then tear back over the ridge. The Krauts would chase us, thinking we were retreating. Then the sky would open up. Our artillery zeroed on the line they crossed. You could see Panthers burning like torches through the haze." By 1600, over 40 German tanks had been destroyed or abandoned. The US losses were minimal, fewer than 10 Hellcats disabled, most by artillery or mechanical failure. The Germans were stunned. They had attacked expecting lumbering Shermans, but instead faced machines that moved with the fluidity of cavalry and struck like snipers. Colonel Bruce Clark, commanding the 4th Armoured Division's Combat Command A, noted in his report to Patton that the tank destroyers fought with the spirit of horsemen. Patton, reading the communiqué, scrawled his own note in the margin. "The Hellcat, our modern cavalryman, fast, aggressive, and everywhere at once." That day cemented the M18's reputation not as a tank destroyer in the conventional sense, but as a tactical predator, a force multiplier whose speed and daring reshaped battlefield tempo. At dusk, the battle quieted. Smoke curled above the hedgerows. The German survivors withdrew eastward, their offensive shattered. In a field near Juvelais, Sergeant Ricky and his crew stood beside their Hellcat, the barrel still warm. 55 miles an hour and we still can't outrun our own luck, his gunner joked. Ricky just smiled, brushing soot from the turret. "Speed saved us today," he said. "Speed and surprise." In Berlin, news of the defeat arrived days later. Wehrmacht analysts at the OKH, Oberkommando des Heeres, classified the new American vehicle as Panzerjäger M18, extremely fast, lightly armoured, open turret. Their conclusion read, "To be engaged only in open terrain and under favourable conditions. Avoid ambush." But by then the damage was done. The myth of invincibility surrounding German armour had cracked. When veterans of the 11th Panzer met their American counterparts at a 1962 symposium in Munich, one German officer finally admitted what they'd whispered in the field back then. "We thought it was sorcery." No tank should move that fast. And yet it had, an open-topped, gasoline-fueled, paper-armoured machine built not to withstand blows, but to avoid them altogether. As night fell over Arracourt, the Hellcats rested silent, their crews exhausted, their engines ticking as they cooled. They had proven the doctrine their designers once sketched on chalkboards in Detroit and Aberdeen. If you cannot armour a man from death, give him the means to outrun it. The Germans never forgot the lesson. And somewhere in the fog, the phantom still rolled, 55 miles an hour through the hedgerows, unseen until it struck. Autumn, 1944. The smell of wet earth and burning oil lingered over the Lorraine plains. The Hellcats had turned Arracourt into a graveyard of panthers, and in Berlin, disbelief turned to analysis. At the Oberkommando des Heeres, reports from frontline units were being collated under a single chilling heading: high-speed tank destroyer, open-topped abnormal mobility. To the Germans, who had spent years perfecting the balance of armour, firepower and engineering, the M18 Hellcat seemed like an aberration. Its speed violated every expectation of tank warfare. In October, surviving officers of the 11th Panzer Division were interrogated by Allied intelligence after the war. One major, Otto von Manteuffel, described his first encounter. It appeared from the side roads as if it had been fired from a gun itself. Before my gunner could even rotate, it vanished again. Our shells never landed where it had been, because by the time we fired, it was no longer there. German technical departments scrambled to classify this new enemy. In captured documents, later archived in the US Army's G2 reports volume, YV, engineers described it as a light tank of unconventional purpose, assuming it was a specialized reconnaissance or airborne unit. They never quite understood that the Hellcat wasn't built to hold ground. It was built to control momentum. By late 1944, German Panzer doctrine was cracking under pressure. Their heavy armour, Tigers, Panthers and Jagdpanzers, dominated on open plains but struggled in the rolling bocage and forest roads of France. The Hellcat's ability to relocate faster than any German tank could traverse gave it an unmatched advantage. The irony, of course, was that the M18 had no real armour to speak of, just 12.7 millimetres at its thickest. Yet that was the secret. The Hellcat lived because it wasn't burdened by the illusion of invulnerability. Back in Europe, the US Army's Tank Destroyer Command was vindicated, at least temporarily. Brigadier General Andrew Bruce, the architect of the Seek, Strike, Destroy philosophy, had long argued that speed was the ultimate protection. In his 1942 memorandum to the Ordnance Department, he wrote, "A tank destroyer must move faster than any enemy tank. It must never duel. It must ambush, disengage and re-engage on its own terms." The M18 Hellcat embodied that creed. Built by Buick in just over 2 years from drawing board to deployment, it was a triumph of American automotive engineering. Its Continental R975 radial engine, originally designed for aircraft, gave it 400 horsepower and a top speed of 55 miles per hour on roads, nearly double that of a Panther. But doctrine was shifting even as the Hellcats roared through France. The army was learning that wars were won not just by killing tanks, but by holding ground. The Hellcat's open turret, which gave its crews excellent visibility, also left them vulnerable to artillery, snipers, and even grenades. Its gasoline engine turned every hit into a fire hazard. The men who fought in them knew the trade-off well. Lieutenant Robert Bob Kreiser of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion recalled in a 1985 veterans reunion in Hawaii, "We weren't brave because we had armour. We were brave because we didn't. You couldn't sit and fight. You had to keep moving. That's what kept you alive." There was something psychological about the Hellcat, something almost supernatural to those who fought against it. Its engine had a distinct high-pitched whine that echoed down roads and valleys. Crews said they could hear it long before they saw it, and when they did see it, it was usually too late. German troops gave it a nickname, Der Flüsterjäger, the Whispering Hunter. But the sound also haunted the men inside. The engine roared inches behind their heads, deafening and hot. The open-topped design offered no insulation from the cold, rain or incoming shrapnel. Some crews wore football helmets under their tank destroyer caps to cushion against bumps when hitting potholes at full throttle. Mechanically, the Hellcat was a masterpiece of improvisation. Maintenance crews in the field could strip and rebuild a transmission in under 3 hours. Spare parts arrived through the same supply chains that serviced civilian Buicks. The American industrial advantage, the ability to mass-produce, repair and replace, gave the Hellcat longevity the Germans couldn't match. By winter 1944, the Hellcat had become a legend within the ranks of Patton's Third Army. At mess tents, men told stories of tank destroyer platoons outrunning German artillery barrages, or of crews who drifted down icy French roads at 40 miles per hour while reloading on the move. But behind the bravado were nerves of steel and an acceptance of constant risk. The open turret meant exposure. Machine gun rounds from above could sweep across the crew compartment. Fragments from airbursts could cut men to ribbons. In the 13th Corps operational log, December 1944, one entry stood out. The M18 crews show remarkable morale. Casualty rate remains high, but their aggressiveness increases proportionally to their success. They regard themselves as cavalrymen, not tankers. That self-image mattered. The Hellcat was more than a weapon. It was a state of mind. After Arracourt, the Germans adapted. They began deploying more infantry screens and using ambush tactics of their own, positioning anti-tank guns along likely Hellcat approach routes. But the Hellcat crews, trained for reconnaissance and flexibility, simply found new paths. In one notable skirmish near the Saar River in November 1944, a platoon from the 602nd TD Battalion used their speed to outflank a German ambush entirely, attacking from behind at full throttle. In just 7 minutes, they destroyed 4 tanks and escaped with no losses. Captured German reports from that engagement recorded, "They move like cavalry, reckless, unpredictable, faster than we can adjust. Our armour is irrelevant if we cannot bring it to bear." As 1944 turned to 1945, the Hellcat became a symbol of ingenuity, a contradiction on tracks. It was fragile but fierce, exposed yet elusive. Its crews called it the Buick bullet. In one of the final wartime issues of Stars and Stripes, a journalist embedded with the 601st wrote, "They don't just fight in Hellcats, they race them. When the road's clear, they're gone before the ink dries on a map." By war's end, Hellcat battalions had destroyed more enemy armour per engagement than any other US armoured unit type. Their kill-to-loss ratio, nearly 5-1, was unmatched. And still, when you read the German diaries, there's that recurring phrase, "It was there, and then it wasn't." The M18 Hellcat wasn't just a tank destroyer. It was an idea, the embodiment of American doctrine at its boldest, a weapon built not for endurance, but for initiative. Its speed didn't just save lives, it terrified the enemy, disrupted command structures, and rewrote the mental map of the battlefield. By the time snow fell over the Ardennes, and the German counter-offensive began to rumble westward, the myth of the Hellcat had already spread from the hedgerows of Normandy to the mountain passes of Alsace. And in the fog, the whispering engines returned. The Ardennes Forest, December 1944. Snow drifted across the narrow roads of Belgium, muffling sound, disguising movement. From the east came the growl of German engines, Tiger IIs, Panthers and Jagdpanzer IVs, rolling west in the last great gamble of the Reich, the Battle of the Bulge. The M18 Hellcat, a creature of speed and open horizons, suddenly found itself fighting in a white labyrinth. Trees hemmed in its mobility, ice coated the roads, and visibility was measured in meters. For men whose survival depended on movement, the Ardennes felt like a death trap. Yet in that frozen chaos, the Hellcat's legend deepened. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, attached to the 101st Airborne Division, was among the first to reach Bastogne. Their mission was desperate: hold the road network that anchored the American defense. They had only 34 M18s, fuel for 2 days, and temperatures that froze oil in the lines. On December 20th, as German armour pushed toward the town, Lieutenant Jim Leach's platoon dug into defensive positions near the Neuville Road. His men had covered their Hellcats with snow-soaked tarps and cut branches, engines idling intermittently to prevent freezing. Then came the sound, the deep, throaty thunder of Tiger tanks. The Hellcat crews braced themselves. Leach whispered into his throat mic, "Hold until you can see the whites of their crosses." At 200 yards, the Tigers appeared through the fog, their massive silhouettes dwarfing everything around them. Leach's gunner, Sergeant Dan Godfrey, exhaled and fired. The 76mm round struck the lead Tiger's track joint, shearing it clean. Before the Germans could react, the Hellcat's engine roared to life. It shot backward down the slope at 45 miles per hour, leaving behind a smoking wreck. The other M18s repeated the maneuver, firing, then disappearing in reverse, using every bend and hollow of the terrain to vanish. The Germans, accustomed to slugging matches, were left bewildered. After the battle, captured Wehrmacht reports, ATIS Interrogation File 214, noted, "Their small, fast tanks fight like hunters. They strike from nowhere and move faster than we can aim. It is unnerving." The Hellcat's open turret, a liability in summer, became a nightmare in the Ardennes winter. Snow fell directly into the fighting compartment. Crews fought wrapped in blankets, faces burned raw by cold wind. "It was like driving a convertible through hell," one gunner from the 602nd Battalion recalled in a post-war interview. Still, the M18's speed made it invaluable. Roads clogged with retreating infantry and wrecks, yet the Hellcats darted through gaps, delivering fire support and reconnaissance faster than any Sherman or half-track could manage. On December 24th, near Marvy, a platoon from the 705th ambushed a column of German armoured cars. Their commander, Lieutenant Edward McGeehee, later wrote in his diary, now preserved at the National World War II Museum, "We hit them at dawn. They didn't expect armour that early. Our engines had been off all night to avoid detection. When we started them, the snow blew off the decks like smoke. 3 minutes later, it was over." That kind of speed, instant, shocking, predatory, became the defining image of the Hellcat in the Bulge. The Ardennes campaign became a proving ground for opposing philosophies. The Germans believed in armoured superiority, heavy steel, long-range gunnery, brute endurance. The Americans, with their Hellcats and mobile artillery, believed in flexibility and tempo. Colonel Bruce Clark, commanding at St. Vith, described it perfectly in his field notes. "They built tanks to withstand punishment. We built Hellcats to dodge it. We both killed the other, but we moved faster." It was a war of nerves as much as steel. German crews reported phantom tanks attacking from multiple directions, sometimes the same Hellcat platoon striking 2 positions within an hour. By Christmas Eve, the siege of Bastogne was tightening. The 705th's Hellcats had fought almost non-stop for 5 days, engines freezing, transmissions cracking, crews sleepless. Yet they remained mobile. In one engagement outside Bizery, Sergeant Fred Eberle's M18 was hit by an 88mm shell that passed through the thin armour, killing his loader instantly. Eberle refused evacuation. He and the remaining crew patched the hole with sheet metal from a wrecked half-track, reloaded, and went back into the fight. When Patton's Third Army broke through the German lines 2 days later, many of those same Hellcats rolled out to meet them, scarred, battered, and still running. Captured diaries from the 2nd Panzer Division, analysed in the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946, contain striking admissions. The Americans have a tank that is as fast as a truck. It is thin and open, but impossible to destroy if it will not stay still. We tried to outflank them, but they simply vanished. Our radio operators called them the Silver Ghosts. Even when immobilized, the Hellcat's crews refused surrender. One instance near Assenois recorded a single disabled M18 holding off 2 German tanks for nearly 20 minutes, firing until its gun overheated. By January 1945, the German advance had been broken. The Hellcats of the 705 and 602 had helped delay and disrupt armoured thrusts, buying time for the counterattack. A post-war ordnance summary noted, "Despite freezing weather, lack of supplies and overwhelming opposition, M18 units maintained 83% operational readiness. Their effectiveness was disproportional to their weight, protection, or numbers." In the words of one weary Hellcat commander, interviewed decades later at the 1985 Pacific and European Veterans Reunion, "They said we drove too fast for armour. We said armour was too slow for us. The snow melted, the roads turned to mud, and the Hellcats, those wild, reckless chariots of the US Army, rolled east once more toward the Rhine. The winter hunt was over, but their legend had only just begun." By February 1945, the war in Western Europe had become a race against exhaustion. The German armies were retreating toward the Rhine, their tanks scarce, their fuel scarcer still. Yet even as the Reich collapsed, its defenders remained deadly. For the M18 Hellcat crews, the final months of the war would be some of the hardest, not because the enemy was stronger, but because he was cornered. The Hellcats were now the tip of the spear. Across Luxembourg and into Western Germany, they led armoured columns, scouting roads, ambushing rearguard forces, and racing through towns before the infantry could catch up. Lieutenant Jack Hazard of the 602nd Tank Destroyer Battalion recalled the moment they crossed into Germany, near Bitburg. The roads were lined with burned trucks, half-buried guns, and dead horses. But we couldn't stop. The order was to keep pressure on them, keep them running. The Hellcat's 55 miles per hour road speed made it ideal for pursuit warfare. Entire German units were caught mid-retreat, their columns shredded by sudden 76mm fire. The M18's light weight let it cross bridges that Sherman's couldn't risk, giving American forces flexibility that confounded German planners. But the crews were tired. They'd been fighting since Normandy, most of them living inside their machines, sleeping under the open turrets, eating K-rations out of shell boxes. "We smelled like gas, gunpowder, and cold coffee," one Hellcat commander later said. In those weeks, the M18 had evolved from a specialized tank destroyer into a fast attack vehicle, a reconnaissance scout, even a makeshift assault gun. Doctrine had dissolved, experience had taken over. Near Remagen, German armour tried to buy time for demolition teams preparing to destroy the Ludendorff Bridge. A platoon from the 811th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with Hellcats, found themselves duelling with Jagdpanthers, Germany's heaviest tank destroyers. The odds were hopeless, but speed once again shifted the equation. The American commander, Captain Fred Miller, ordered his crews to engage from 3 directions at once. The Hellcats darted between the cover of stone walls, firing on the move. Their first shots bounced off the Jagdpanther's frontal armour, but the Germans hesitated, uncertain how many opponents they faced. In that instant, US artillery joined in, bracketing the position. When the smoke cleared, 2 Jagdpanthers were burning, the rest retreating. Miller's platoon had survived without a single loss. Post-war German reports, later analysed in US Strategic Bombing Survey, Armour Performance in the West, 1947, recorded that engagement in disbelief. Enemy light tanks manoeuvre with impossible rapidity. We could not maintain traverse on multiple targets. They fight like mosquitoes. Urban fighting was never what the M18 was built for, but by early 1945 it became unavoidable. Town after town, from Prüm to Koblenz, became a maze of stone and rubble. The Hellcats were forced to adapt. In Trier, platoon leader Sergeant Louis "Red" Fenwick ordered his crew to strip the vehicle's machine gun and mount it for street-level suppression. The 76mm gun fired high-explosive shells through walls, supporting infantry assaults. It was crude, but effective. A 1945 report from the 704th Battalion recorded, "The M18, though unsuited to direct urban engagement, has repeatedly demonstrated psychological and practical value. The sight and sound of its approach causes disarray among retreating enemy troops. Civilians began to see it too, the sleek turret, the bare metal hull, the roaring Buick engine echoing through cobblestone streets. To many liberated towns, the Hellcat became the first visible symbol of freedom. Fast, loud, unstoppable. By March, with the Rhine breached and the Ruhr pocket forming, the Tank Destroyer Command was already writing its own epitaph. The original vision, independent, mobile anti-tank forces operating in battalion-sized formations, had given way to flexible combined arms warfare. The Hellcat had outlived its doctrine. It had proven speed's worth, but also its limits. Major Harold Bond, Ordnance Department liaison at the front, wrote to Washington, "The M18 has done more than destroy enemy armour. It has demonstrated that manoeuvre is the ultimate weapon. Armour that can move is armour that can think." The Army took note. The lessons of the M18, agility, initiative, mechanical reliability, would later shape the design of post-war vehicles like the M24 Chaffee and the M41 Walker Bulldog. On March 23, 1945, the Hellcats of the 602nd rolled across the Rhine near Mainz. They'd come nearly 700 miles from the hedgerows of Normandy. Their journey was written in scars, patched armour, mismatched parts, barrels replaced in field depots. Yet most were still running. When the first M18 crossed into the heart of Germany, they did so not with triumph, but with exhaustion. The men were skeletal, the engines worn. Still, they drove at top speed down every road, overtaking tanks, half-tracks, even trucks. "It was like racing to the finish line of the world," one gunner said years later. Behind them lay the ruins of a defeated empire. Ahead, the silence of victory. The Germans had learned to dread the whine of the Hellcat's engine, a sound that meant the fight was lost before it began. By the time they crossed the Rhine, those engines had become something more than noise. They were the heartbeat of a doctrine that prized courage over armour, ingenuity over steel. And when the final orders came to halt, the crews sat in their open turrets, watching the river shimmer in the spring light, and wondered what they'd built. A weapon of war, or a machine that outran its own time. The winter of 1945 hung over Europe like a dying breath, cold, smoky, and final. For the men of the US 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, the Ardennes had been a crucible. Now, as the tide of war rolled east, the M18 Hellcat, the phantom of the hedgerows, became a symbol of what American ingenuity and reckless courage could achieve when necessity stripped war to its essence. By February, the Hellcats were spearheading drives through the Siegfried Line, racing ahead of infantry columns, dashing through shattered towns whose names blurred into coordinates and grid squares. Their Buick engines howled across the frozen countryside, like a pack of wolves chasing the retreat, one Hellcat commander later recalled. Intelligence briefings from the US Army's 12th Corps warned of German armour regrouping east of Trier. The battered remnants of the 2nd Panzer Division had retreated there, supported by ad hoc Kampfgruppen, and were expected to make a last stand near the Moselle. The 705th, attached to the 4th Armoured Division, was ordered to advance rapidly and exploit any breakthrough. Captain Stanley "Red" Hildebrand, a veteran of Normandy and Bastogne, gathered his crews inside a ruined barn. The men stood in a circle, snow melting from their boots. They were gaunt, hollow-eyed, and efficient, soldiers who had long ago shed the illusions of glory. "Remember," Hildebrand said, jabbing at a map spread over a crate, "speed is our armour. Keep moving. The moment you stop, you're a target." The words were not bravado. They were doctrine. The Hellcat's armour, barely an inch on the hull and thinner on the turret, could be pierced by nearly every German anti-tank weapon, from the ubiquitous 75mm PaK-40 to the shoulder-fired Panzerfaust. But its gift was movement. At 55 miles per hour on road, the M18 could reposition faster than a Panzer could traverse its turret. As dawn bled across the horizon, the Hellcats roared to life, cutting through mist and exhaust. They moved in bounding overwatch, alternating between wooded cover and open fields. The 76mm guns, loaded with HVAP rounds, gleamed faintly in the pale light. By mid-morning, scouts radioed in. "Enemy armour, 2 Mark IVs and 1 Panther, grid 47-13. Hildebrand's column halted. "We go wide," he ordered. "We flank, fast and quiet." The Hellcats darted through the tree line, engines throttled low. They fanned out across a shallow ridge, every movement rehearsed through months of lethal trial. When the Panther finally came into view, its long 75mm gun swinging toward the road, Hildebrand's gunner, Sergeant Paul "Mac" McConnell, fired first. The shot struck the Panther's side plate just as it rotated to fire. A burst of orange flame erupted from the engine deck. The German crew scrambled out, one man engulfed in fire. The second Hellcat destroyed the trailing Panzer IV with a single shot through its turret ring. The third enemy tank retreated, firing blindly before vanishing into the forest. 3 minutes, Hildebrand muttered, glancing at his watch. That's all it took. In the aftermath, the tank destroyer crews found themselves contemplating what they had become, not just soldiers, but mechanics of velocity. The Hellcat wasn't armour, Lieutenant Vernon Jacobs wrote in his after-action notes. It was an idea that speed could defy fear. The Germans, for their part, still struggled to classify it. Captured documents from the Wehrmacht's Panzer Lehrdivision referred to it as leichter amerikanischer Kampfpanzer, unfassbare Geschwindigkeit, light American combat tank, incomprehensible speed. One German officer, interrogated after the war, admitted, "We thought at first it was reconnaissance. No tank could move that fast and shoot that straight." But the Hellcat's brilliance came at a cost. Its thin armour and open turret left crews brutally exposed. The casualty rate among M18 battalions in 1944–45 was nearly double that of Sherman units, particularly during defensive actions where speed offered no escape. "Every shell that hit us was a coin toss," recalled Private First Class James Withers of the 601st Battalion. "If it didn't hit the ammo rack, maybe we'd crawl out. If it did, you never even heard it coming." By March 1945, the Hellcats were at the Rhine River supporting Operation Lumberjack, the push toward Remagen. Film footage from the US Army Signal Corps shows M18s racing across pontoon bridges, their White Star insignia smeared with mud and soot. The war was collapsing, but danger remained in every ambush, every town that refused to surrender. In one remarkable engagement outside Andernach, an M18 platoon under Lieutenant Walter Hunter pursued retreating German half-tracks at over 50 miles per hour, firing on the move, a tactic few other Allied armoured units dared attempt. Hunter's after-action report read, "The Hellcat can fight like a shark, in motion, unseen until it bites." When the battalion halted that evening, mechanics checked track tension, patched bullet holes, and refueled. Around them, the war's end felt tangible, but so did fatigue. "You could smell victory," Sergeant McConnell said later, "but it stank of gasoline and cordite." On May 8, 1945, as Germany surrendered, the surviving Hellcats stood silent on muddy roads and in captured towns. Some were lined up for inspection, others had been stripped for parts. Crews sat on their turrets, smoking, staring into the distance. The M18 had been a paradox, both feared and fragile. It had killed panzers that were theoretically invincible, yet it had done so without ever pretending to be their equal. It relied not on armour, but on daring, teamwork, and a machine that defied logic. In post-war analysis, US Army ordnance officers debated the concept. Many argued that the tank destroyer doctrine, mobility over protection, had outlived its moment. Yet in the Hellcat, the idea had achieved its purest expression. At the 1962 US-German Armoured Symposium in Bonn, a former Wehrmacht Panzer commander, Major Ernst Bachmann, was asked what weapon most surprised him in Normandy. He replied without hesitation, "The small, fast one, the Hellcat." It was like fighting a ghost. Decades later, in a quiet corner of the National World War II Museum, an M18 Hellcat sits restored to its wartime sheen. The plaque beside it bears the names of the men of the 705th and 601st Battalions, many of whom never came home. Visitors often marvel at its speed. 55 miles per hour, they ask, as if war could ever be measured in miles. But for those who drove it, the number meant survival. In his final wartime diary entry, Captain Hildebrand wrote, "They called it reckless." Maybe it was, but for us, the faster we moved, the longer we lived. And somewhere in the yellowed pages of a captured German field report, an officer had written almost grudgingly, "It was there, and then it wasn't." The phantom of the hedgerows, born of American steel, Buick engineering, and human nerve, had vanished into history, leaving behind only the echo of its engine and the legend of the machine that refused to slow down.